The air hung heavy and still, thick with the scent of damp earth and ancient pines, as a sound ripped through the twilight hush. It was unlike anything Ethan had ever heard, a chilling, guttural cry that seemed to claw at the very fabric of the forest's silence. Not the mournful howl of a wolf, nor the startled bellow of an elk, and certainly not the screech of a bobcat. This was something deeper, more resonant, laced with an undeniable, raw emotion that pierced the quiet of the Pacific Northwest wilderness he called home. The sound echoed, bouncing off the rugged inclines and dense canopy, lingering in the cool air long after its initial burst, a question mark hanging over the encroaching darkness. It was a sound that prickled the skin and stirred a primal instinct to either flee or investigate, a primeval lament emanating from the seemingly impenetrable depths of the woods. Ethan, a man whose life had become inextricably intertwined with the solitude of this remote landscape, paused mid-stir of his nightly stew. His cabin, a weathered testament to resilience nestled deep within the vast expanse of towering conifers, had been his sanctuary for the better part of a decade. He was a wilderness photographer by trade, or rather, by calling. His lens a silent witness to the magnificent, untamed beauty that surrounded him. But his devotion to this secluded existence stemmed from a deeper, more profound need for solace. A personal tragedy, a wound still fresh despite the years, had driven him from the clamor of the urban world, seeking refuge in the unyielding rhythms of nature. Here, among the whispering trees and the rushing rivers, he found a quiet understanding, a mirror to his own profound sorrow. His hands, calloused from years of trekking and gear handling, stilled. He cocked his head, listening intently, his acute sensitivity to the nuances of the natural world kicking in. Every rustle of leaves, every distant hoot of an owl, every snap of a twig on the forest floor, typically registered as familiar notes in the wilderness symphony. But this cry, this elongated wail, was a discordant, unsettling improvisation. It carried a strange, almost human-like quality, a depth of feeling that sent a shiver tracing its way down his spine. He walked to the small, grimy window overlooking the tree line, peering into the growing gloom. The forest, a familiar embrace during the day, now seemed to press in, its shadows deepening into an ominous, watchful presence. He tried to rationalize it away, as he always did with the unexplained. Perhaps a cougar, unusually vocal, or a wounded bear. The wilderness held its share of strange noises, especially in the transition from dusk to full night. His logical mind, trained to dissect and categorize, wrestled with the unfamiliarity of the sound. He told himself it was just a misidentified animal, a trick of the wind carrying an ordinary sound in an extraordinary way. Yet the cry had resonated with something ancient within him, a chord of empathy for whatever creature had uttered such a heartfelt lament. It wasn't the sound of a predator, nor prey. It was the sound of profound distress, perhaps even grief, an emotion he understood all too well. He returned to his stew, stirring mechanically, but the echo of the cry lingered. It had burrowed deep into his mind, an unwanted guest refusing to leave. The forest, which had always offered him a balm, now held a new, unsettling mystery. He tried to dismiss it, to focus on the mundane tasks of his evening routine, but the haunting quality of the wail had already set off a subtle ripple in his carefully constructed sense of peace. The wilderness had always provided answers, or at least a path to understanding. Now it presented a question, a raw, emotional query that he couldn't simply ignore. The sound hung in the air, a persistent shadow on the edges of his consciousness, hinting at something far more profound than any ordinary animal encounter. He poured his stew, ate slowly, but his gaze kept drifting towards the dark rectangle of the window, drawn by an invisible thread to the unsettling sound that had shattered the evening's tranquility. Before we dive deeper into Ethan's unsettling discovery and the spine-tingling twists that follow, please hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell to join our community of extraordinary story lovers. Your support helps us bring more captivating tales from the strange and unknown corners of our world directly to you. Now, let's venture further into the shadows. The unsettling, almost human-like, cries from the forest did not subside. If anything, they intensified over the next few nights, weaving themselves into the very fabric of Ethan's isolated existence. At first, they were intermittent, whispers carried on the wind, easily dismissed as the mournful howl of a lone wolf or the eerie screech of a barn owl. But as the moon waxed and waned, the urgency in those sounds grew, evolving from vague distress into a profound, heart-wrenching lament that seemed to pierce through the thick canopy and resonate deep within Ethan's soul. Each wail felt like a direct appeal, pulling at a nascent thread of curiosity and concern that he hadn't known existed. His initial apprehension, a familiar companion in his solitary life, began to wane, slowly but surely overtaken by an insistent, almost magnetic pull. Sleep became a distant memory, replaced by long, restless nights spent staring out of his cabin window, the dense, dark silhouette of the woods, a brooding, enigmatic canvas. He'd listen, every fiber of his being tuned to the forest's symphony, trying to discern the exact origin of the cries. They were always from the same general direction, deeper into the woods than his usual foraging routes, in an area he'd always subconsciously avoided, perhaps out of respect for the untouched wilderness or an unspoken, primal fear of the unknown. That fear, however, now felt less like a warning and more like a challenge. The persistent, almost desperate tenor of the cries began to gnaw at him, transforming his detached observation into a burgeoning sense of responsibility. He felt an inexplicable urge to understand, to alleviate, to simply know. The thought of an animal in prolonged suffering, perhaps injured or trapped, stirred a deep-seated empathy that his years of reclusiveness had largely muted. Driven by this overwhelming compulsion, Ethan finally succumbed. One moonless night, armed only with his most reliable flashlight, a sturdy hunting knife, and a camera, he ventured into the heart of the ancient forest. Each step was deliberate, the damp earth cushioning his boots, the silence between the creature's cries profound and heavy. The air grew colder, denser, imbued with the scent of pine needles and decaying leaves. He moved like a shadow, his wilderness skills honed over decades, allowing him to navigate the treacherous terrain with an almost preternatural ease. The cries became clearer, closer, no longer distant echoes, but immediate, raw expressions of anguish. They led him down a winding, barely discernible game trail, through thickets of blackberry bushes and over moss-covered fallen logs, until the faint glint of water reflected through the trees. And then he saw her, huddled by a secluded riverbank, partially obscured by a curtain of hanging moss and ancient ferns, was the source of the relentless, heartbreaking sounds. It was a creature unlike anything he had ever witnessed, even in his extensive travels through some of the world's most remote wildernesses. Massive, covered in thick, dark fur that seemed to shimmer with the residual dampness of the forest. She sat with her back to him, her enormous shoulders hunched in a posture of profound sorrow. She was undeniably primate-like, yet her sheer scale and the almost human-like quality of her distress transcended any known terrestrial species. Her cries, muffled now by her bowed head and pressed knees, were not the howls of an animal in pain, but the deep, guttural sobs of a being experiencing immense emotional torment. It was a weeping, utterly and unequivocally sorrowful, emanating from the depths of a soul. Ethan froze, his heart pounding a frantic rhythm against his ribs. A primal terror, cold and sharp, initially gripped him. This was not a bear, not a wolf, not any creature cataloged in his extensive knowledge of the natural world. This was something else, something ancient and magnificent, yet utterly vulnerable in its grief. For a fleeting moment, every instinct screamed at him to retreat, to run back to the safety of his cabin and pretend he had never seen her. But that initial fear quickly dissipated, replaced by a profound wave of empathy that washed over him, displacing all other emotions. He saw not a monster, but a distressed individual, a grieving entity, radiating an almost palpable sorrow that resonated with his own unspoken losses. He remained hidden, a silent observer in the shadows, his camera held loosely in a trembling hand. Forgotten for the moment, the creature shifted slightly, a low moan escaping her lips, and Ethan caught a glimpse of her profile. Her face, framed by dark fur, was etched with an expression so profoundly sad, so unmistakably human-like in its despondency, that it stole his breath. Her large, dark eyes, though unseen, he imagined to be brimming with unshed tears. She appeared to be cradling something small and indistinct in her massive hands, intermittently bringing it to her chest, a gesture of tenderness laced with unimaginable despair. He sensed she was mourning, deeply and utterly, and the raw honesty of her sorrow was almost unbearable to witness. He wanted to help, to offer comfort, but he knew any direct action would likely frighten her, perhaps irrevocably. For now, he could only observe, a silent witness to a sorrow so immense it seemed to ripple through the very air of the forest, a sorrow he suddenly felt compelled to understand, even if from a respectful, careful distance. His presence, for now, remained his secret. The quiet empathy Ethan harbored soon blossomed into a tangible desire to bridge the chasm between their worlds, however cautiously. He started with the simplest of gestures, leaving small offerings of food, ripe berries gathered from the sun-drenched clearings, and plump fish he'd caught from the cleaner streams, near the riverbank where he had first encountered the sorrowful creature. Each evening, under the shroud of twilight, he would place the provisions on a flat, moss-covered rock, then retreat silently, disappearing back into the deeper woods, careful to leave no trace of his presence other than the offering itself. He would return to his cabin before dawn, a silent witness to the untouched wilderness, his heart pounding with a strange mix of apprehension and hope. The first few nights the food remained undisturbed, a testament to her innate caution. Ethan understood. Trust was a fragile thing, especially for a creature so profoundly wild. But then, on the fourth morning, a subtle change. The berries were gone, and the fish, though not wholly consumed, bore the unmistakable marks of large, powerful jaws. A spark, tiny yet persistent, ignited within him. She had accepted. A silent, cautious trust, born of necessity, and perhaps a flicker of curiosity, was beginning to form. He continued his nightly ritual, varying the offerings, adding wild mushrooms he knew were safe, and even some dried fruit from his own meager supplies. Each morning, the cleared rock confirmed their deepening, unspoken dialogue. Through continued, painstaking observation, Ethan began to piece together the fragments of her immense sorrow. Her cries, initially raw and universal in their despair, now seemed to carry a specific cadence, a mournful dirge. He noticed her frequent visits to a particular cluster of ancient, gnarled cedars, where she would sit for hours, her massive frame hunched, her gaze fixed on a spot near their roots. One day, emboldened by their nascent connection, Ethan ventured closer after she had left, his heart a drum against his ribs. He studied the area, his experienced eyes scanning for any anomaly. And there, half buried beneath a tangle of ferns and loose earth, he found it. A small, intricately carved wooden figure, smoothed by countless touches, clearly an object of immense sentimental value. Beside it, a scattering of tiny, delicate bones, far too small to belong to an adult Sasquatch, bleached white by the relentless cycles of sun and rain. A profound, aching understanding washed over him. The creature was grieving the loss of a young one. Her cries were not merely cries of pain, but the lament of a mother, her heart shattered by an unspeakable tragedy. This revelation twisted the empathy he felt into something far deeper, a primal connection to her sorrow. His desire to help transcended mere curiosity. It became an imperative, a silent promise to alleviate, however insignificantly, the crushing weight of her grief. He began to leave more than just food. He left a small smooth river stone, polished by eons of water, near her cedar sanctuary, a silent tribute, a shared understanding. He started spending more time near the riverbank, sitting quietly, his camera forgotten in its bag, simply being present. He didn't expect her to approach, didn't even hope for it. He just wanted to offer a silent, steady presence in her world of pain. Then came the day of their first direct interaction, a moment etched into Ethan's memory with the clarity of a freshly developed photograph. He had been sitting by the river, sketching the intricate patterns of sunlight on the water, when he felt a shift in the air, a subtle vibration in the forest floor. He looked up, his breath catching in his throat. Not 20 feet away, partially obscured by the dense foliage of a weeping willow, stood the female Sasquatch. Her massive form was still and silent, her dark eyes, pools of ancient sorrow, fixed upon him. He didn't move, didn't flinch. He simply met her gaze, his own filled not with fear, but with an overwhelming, almost suffocating wave of compassion. Speaking softly, his voice a gentle murmur against the backdrop of the flowing river, he said, "It's okay. I understand. I'm so sorry." The words were simple, inadequate even, but they were all he had. He made no sudden movements, his hands resting openly on his knees, a silent testament to his lack of ill intent. The creature did not flee. She remained, statuesque, her immense chest rising and falling with slow, deliberate breaths. A flicker of something unreadable passed through her eyes, a mix of fear, profound sadness, and perhaps, just perhaps, a nascent recognition of his genuine sympathy. It was a fragile moment, suspended between two worlds, two species, united by the universal language of grief and the unspoken hope of comfort. The forest held its breath, witnessing this impossible, tender exchange. Ethan felt a profound shift within himself. He was no longer merely an observer, but a participant, irrevocably intertwined with the fate of this grieving, magnificent being. He knew, with an undeniable certainty, that his life and hers had just taken an irreversible turn. The forest, once a place of solitude, now felt like a sacred space, holding a secret too precious to betray. Over the following weeks, Ethan dedicated himself entirely to Willow, as he now affectionately called her in his mind. The riverbank became his second home, a place of quiet vigil and shared sorrow. He would arrive before dawn, notebook in hand, and sit patiently, sometimes for hours, simply existing in her presence. She, in turn, grew accustomed to his quiet silhouette, her initial wariness gradually softening into a silent acceptance. He observed her rituals of mourning, the way she would gently touch the ancient cedar, or run her massive hand over the smooth river stones, sometimes emitting soft guttural sounds that resonated with profound loss. It was a grief so raw, so palpable, that it transcended species, washing over Ethan in waves of shared heartache. He didn't try to intervene, merely to bear witness, a silent confidant in her profound solitude. He learned to anticipate her movements, to understand the subtle shifts in her demeanor, and to offer comfort not through words, but through his unwavering, empathetic presence. He began documenting her presence and behavior, not with the intention of scientific publication or sensational revelation, but purely for personal understanding. His camera, once a tool for capturing fleeting wilderness beauty, now painstakingly recorded the nuances of Willow's existence, her preferred foraging spots, her resting habits, the way the forest seemed to bend to her movements, a living, breathing part of the ecosystem. He noted the occasional glimpse of another smaller Sasquatch in the distance, a fleeting shadow, suggesting Willow was not entirely alone, but the grief for her lost young one remained the dominant force in her life. Each photograph, each video snippet, was a testament not just to her existence, but to her undeniable sentience, her deep emotional capacity. These were private records, stored securely on encrypted drives, meant only for his eyes, a sacred trust between him and the magnificent creature of the forest. He became her silent chronicler, driven by a deep conviction that her story, her pain, deserved acknowledgement, even if only from one human heart. However, as the weeks turned into a month, and the bond between Ethan and Willow deepened into an unshakable understanding, a new, unsettling undercurrent began to ripple through Ethan's solitary life. He started to notice subtle disturbances around his cabin, things that, at first, he dismissed as the natural shifts of the wilderness, or perhaps his own imagination, strained by the intensity of his unique companionship. A fallen branch that seemed strategically placed to block a path he regularly used, only to find it moved back to its original position hours later. Flattened patches of grass near his perimeter, too regular to be animal trails, too intentional to be random. The feeling began subtly, a faint prickle at the back of his neck, then grew into a persistent, undeniable sensation. He was being watched. It wasn't Willow's watchful gaze, which had become a comforting presence. This was different, colder, more calculating. It felt like human eyes lurking beyond the periphery of his vision, unseen but undeniably felt. He would pause his chores, camera slung over his shoulder, and scan the dense tree line, the quiet forest suddenly imbued with a new, menacing quality. The familiar rustle of leaves, the distant call of a hawk, once soothing sounds of nature, now seemed to carry an unspoken message, a hidden observer. He began to feel a sense of intrusion, a violation of the sanctity of his secluded existence, and, more importantly, of Willow's fragile peace. This feeling wasn't born of paranoia, but of keen observation, honed over years of solitary living in the wilderness. His acute sensitivity to the rhythms of nature, which had first led him to Willow, now alerted him to this clandestine presence. The feeling intensified, slowly but persistently, morphing into a creeping paranoia. He found himself constantly checking windows, peering into the shadows, his sleep becoming restless and fragmented. He started taking circuitous routes to the river, doubling back, trying to catch a glimpse of whoever might be tailing him. He meticulously examined the forest floor around his cabin, searching for clues, for any definitive proof of his growing unease. That's when he found it, almost perfectly camouflaged among a cluster of ferns near the old logging road that led to his property. A small, almost imperceptible lens, barely larger than a pebble, cleverly embedded in a hollowed-out log. His blood ran cold. This was no random animal trail, no natural occurrence. This was surveillance equipment, expertly placed, designed to be invisible. His breath hitched in his throat as he realized the implication. Whoever was watching him wasn't just observing his cabin, they were observing him, and by extension, Willow. The security of their shared secret, his and Willow's, had been breached. The delicate bond he had so carefully cultivated, the sanctuary he had found in her presence, was now compromised. A wave of dread washed over him, a chilling premonition that his quiet world and Willow's peaceful, grieving existence was about to be irrevocably shattered. The forest, once his haven, now felt like a cage, its every rustle, every shadow, a potential threat. He clutched his camera tighter, its familiar weight a momentary comfort against the sudden, profound vulnerability he felt. He wasn't alone in his knowledge of Willow. Others knew, and their intentions, he instinctively knew, were far less benign than his own. The game, whatever it was, had begun, and Ethan knew, with a sinking feeling, that he and Willow were now unwilling players. The forest, once a haven of solitude and quiet observation, began to thrum with an unsettling undercurrent. Ethan found himself increasingly on edge, the peaceful rhythm of his days interrupted by an insistent feeling of being watched. He dismissed it at first, attributing it to the heightened sensitivity of living so closely with Willow, to his own burgeoning paranoia, born from the extraordinary secret he now carried. But the signs grew more concrete, more undeniable. A broken twig in a place he knew had been clear, a faint, almost imperceptible footprint near his water source that didn't belong to him or Willow. These were not the casual disturbances of passing wildlife. They were deliberate, controlled intrusions. He would find subtle displacements of moss, a flattened patch of ferns, all hinting at a silent, methodical presence. It was as if someone were meticulously surveying his movements, analyzing his routines. His intuition, honed by years of wilderness living, screamed a warning he couldn't ignore. He tried to rationalize it away, but the evidence mounted. One morning, returning from a pre-dawn observation of Willow at the river, he pushed open his cabin door only to freeze. There, tacked haphazardly to the weathered wood by a small rusty nail, was a folded piece of paper. His heart hammered against his ribs like a trapped bird. The paper was plain, unremarkable, but the message scrawled on it, in hurried, blocky letters, was anything but. Some things are best left undisturbed. No signature, no other markings, just those stark, chilling words that confirmed his worst fears. His discovery of Willow had not gone unnoticed. Someone knew, and they wanted him to stop. A cold dread seeped into him, chilling his very bones. This wasn't a random warning. It was targeted, specific. It meant someone had been watching him, watching Willow, for a significant period. The anonymity of the note only amplified its menace. Who were these people? What did they want? And more importantly, what would they do if he didn't heed their ominous advice? The peaceful isolation he had sought in the wilderness now felt like a fragile illusion, shattered by the reality of unseen eyes and sinister intentions. The warning, instead of deterring him, ignited a fierce protective instinct. Ethan hadn't spent years rebuilding his life in this remote haven, only to be scared off by a cryptic message. And he certainly wasn't about to abandon Willow, not after the fragile bond they had forged, not after witnessing her profound grief. He knew what he had to do. He immediately began fortifying his cabin. He wasn't equipped for a siege, but he could make it less inviting, more difficult to access without detection. He reinforced his doors with additional bolts, installed motion-activated lights around the perimeter, and meticulously trimmed back the dense underbrush near his windows to eliminate potential hiding spots. His cabin, once a sanctuary, transformed into a makeshift fortress. He also repurposed his photographic equipment. His high-end cameras, typically used for capturing the subtle nuances of wildlife, now became instruments of defense. He set up a rudimentary surveillance system, discreetly placing trail cameras at various points along the paths, leading to his cabin and around the riverbank where Willow frequented. He connected them to a small portable monitor inside, creating a crude but effective early warning system. Every rustle, every shadow would now be scrutinized. He also started carrying his camera everywhere, its powerful zoom lens a constant reminder of his mission: to document, to protect, to create an undeniable record should anything happen. He felt an urgent need to protect Willow, not just from the unknown threats, but also to ensure her continued existence was recognized, even if it was only by him for now. He knew that knowledge was power, and in this escalating game of cat and mouse, he needed all the power he could muster. The atmosphere in the forest also shifted. Willow, usually a creature of quiet habit, became noticeably more agitated. Her deep-set eyes, which had slowly begun to reflect a glimmer of tentative trust and peace in Ethan's presence, now held a renewed flicker of unease. She would often pause during her foraging, her massive head cocked, her keen senses straining towards the forest edge. She would emit low, rumbling vocalizations, unlike her usual mournful cries or gentle hums. These were sounds of alert, of warning. She would stare intently into the dense canopy, her brow furrowed, as if discerning a presence that Ethan, despite his best efforts, could not yet perceive. He observed her growing disquiet with a heavy heart. It was clear she sensed the shift in the environment, the intrusion of human presence, perhaps even the malevolent intent behind it. She was more skittish, less likely to linger by the river, often retreating into the deeper, more secluded parts of the forest. Her vigilance was constant, a primal radar detecting danger long before Ethan's technology could. He saw her occasionally glance towards his cabin, a silent message in her gaze, a shared burden of apprehension. It was as if she understood the implications of the anonymous note, the growing shadow that now stretched over their fragile, shared world. The unspoken understanding between them deepened further, morphing from shared grief into a shared vigilance, a silent pact against the encroaching unknown. Ethan knew he had to act, and soon, because the peace, tenuous as it was rapidly crumbling, and the next move, he sensed, would not be his. The forest held its breath once more, but this time, it was not in quiet witness, but in anxious anticipation of what was to come. The subtle disturbances around his cabin, which had once felt like an intermittent shiver down his spine, now solidified into a pervasive, chilling certainty. Ethan knew he was being watched, and it wasn't Willow. His rudimentary surveillance system, cobbled together from trail cameras and motion sensors he usually deployed for wildlife photography, began to yield unsettling results. Blurred images of vehicles, always dark, often heavily tinted, and consistently unmarked, traversing the remote access roads that led to his secluded haven. They moved with an unsettling purpose, their presence a stark violation of the wilderness's quiet sanctity. These weren't lost tourists or curious hikers. These were professionals, operating with an almost surgical precision that spoke of training and resources far beyond what he could fathom. Each time a new image popped up on his screen, a cold knot tightened in his stomach, a visceral premonition of impending confrontation. One particularly ominous afternoon, as a dense fog rolled in from the mountains, shrouding the already secluded cabin in an even deeper veil of isolation. His motion sensor by the main access road tripped. The blurry image displayed on his monitor revealed a sleek black SUV, its design almost featureless, idling near the old logging turnoff. It sat there for an unnervingly long time, a silent, predatory sentinel, before slowly, almost imperceptibly, reversing and vanishing back into the misty expanse. The professional grade of the vehicle, the deliberate anonymity, screamed of an operation far removed from local law enforcement or curious neighbors. His gut clenched. They were circling, tightening the net. The inevitable confrontation arrived 2 days later, under a sky that mirrored the oppressive grayness of his mood. Ethan was inside, reviewing some of his newly installed camera feeds, when he heard the crunch of gravel outside, a sound that immediately put him on high alert. He peered cautiously through a gap in his curtains. 2 figures were emerging from another identical black SUV, this one parked brazenly in his small, usually empty clearing. They moved with an almost unnatural synchronicity, their dark suits stark against the muted greens and browns of the forest. These were not men who dressed for the wilderness. These were men who brought their own sterile urban environment with them. As they approached his door, their footsteps were measured, deliberate. He took a deep breath, pushing down the surge of adrenaline, and opened the door just wide enough to address them. The men were impeccably dressed, their suits tailored to perfection, their black ties a stark contrast to their pale, unsmiling faces. Their sunglasses, even indoors, remained firmly in place, obscuring their eyes and lending an air of impenetrable anonymity. The aura they exuded was one of quiet authority, a silent, pervasive menace. "Mr. Ethan Vance?" the taller of the two asked, his voice flat, devoid of inflection. He held up a laminated card, but kept it just out of Ethan's easy viewing range, displaying only a vague, official-looking emblem. "We're here regarding certain unusual activities in this area." Ethan maintained a carefully neutral expression, his hands clasped loosely in front of him. "And who exactly are we?" he inquired, his voice calm despite the frantic hammering of his heart. The shorter man stepped slightly forward, his gaze sweeping over Ethan's cabin with an unnerving thoroughness. "Let's just say we represent an agency concerned with national security and the protection of sensitive ecological zones. We've received reports of unauthorized incursions and potential disturbances in the protected wilderness surrounding your property." Ethan scoffed inwardly at the thinly veiled threat. "Unauthorized incursions? I'm a photographer, gentlemen. I live here. My incursions, as you call them, are part of my life and my work. As for disturbances, the only disturbance I've noticed lately are unmarked vehicles driving on private roads." He let his gaze linger pointedly on their SUV. The taller man's lips barely twitched. "We understand your connection to the land, Mr. Vance. However, our concerns extend beyond typical recreational activities. We're specifically interested in any unusual animal sightings Large, bipedal creatures, perhaps? His voice dropped slightly on the last phrase, making it sound more like a statement than a question. A cold certainty settled over Ethan. This wasn't about land use. It was about Willow. They knew. Unusual animal sightings. Ethan feigned a thoughtful expression, tapping a finger against his chin. Well, I see plenty of deer, elk, the occasional bear. Nothing I'd consider unusual for this neck of the woods, unless you count a particularly grumpy badger I tangled with last week. He forced a small, disarming smile that felt utterly fake. He knew they wouldn't be fooled, but he desperately needed to buy time to assess their true intent. The shorter man's expression remained impassive. Mr. Vance, we have reason to believe that you've been spending an inordinate amount of time near the riverbank, particularly in an area not typically frequented by hikers or local fauna. We've also noted a significant increase in your camera usage in that specific vicinity. Ethan felt a surge of anger, but kept his voice even. My photography takes me to all sorts of places, and my camera usage, as you phrase it, is my livelihood. Are you suggesting I'm not allowed to photograph nature on public land or within sight of my own property? He subtly asserted his rights, knowing full well they were treading on thin ice, but also acutely aware of the power imbalance. The taller man's gaze sharpened, piercing through Ethan's feigned ignorance. We are merely suggesting, Mr. Vance, that certain activities can draw unwanted attention and create complications. It would be in your best interest to cease any unauthorized exploration or documentation of sensitive phenomena. Some things are best left undisturbed. The phrase hung in the air, a chilling echo of the anonymous note he'd found days ago. The threat, though unspoken, was palpable, a heavy weight in the humid air. They weren't asking, they were warning, and the veiled menace in their eyes left no doubt about the consequences of noncompliance. Ethan sensed their underlying threat, not just to his activities, but to Willow's very existence. He knew this was just the beginning. The black SUVs returned 2 days later, not just one, but 3, fanning out purposefully around his property. This time, there was no pretense of a polite inquiry. The same 2 men, flanked by 2 others in identical dark suits, emerged from the vehicles. Their faces were carved from granite, their eyes devoid of warmth. They marched directly to his door, their footsteps crunching loudly on the gravel, a stark contrast to the quiet rustling of leaves that usually marked the only interruption to the forest's peace. Mr. Vance, the taller man began, his voice hard as flint. We've returned to ensure our previous conversation was adequately understood. Your activities have continued, and your defiance is becoming problematic. He didn't wait for Ethan to speak. Let us be unequivocally clear. You will cease all excursions into the specified area. You will delete any and all photographic or video recordings you may possess related to unusual wildlife. And you will forget anything you believe you have seen. This is not a request, Mr. Vance. This is an instruction. The shorter man stepped forward, his voice a low, menacing growl. Your research permits for this area can be revoked. Your land rights can be challenged under various federal conservation acts. Your ability to earn a living, to even operate a camera, can be severely hampered. There are many ways to make a life in the wilderness very uncomfortable, Mr. Vance. We have resources you cannot begin to comprehend. The subtle threats of their previous visit had now shed their thin disguise, revealing the cold, sharp edges of explicit intimidation. They were no longer speaking in veiled warnings. They were dictating terms, backed by the implied power of an unseen, unchallengeable authority. Ethan felt the weight of their combined gaze, a pressure designed to crush resistance. Yet, a calm resolve had settled over Ethan in the hours after their last visit. He had anticipated this escalation. He met their hard stares with an unblinking intensity of his own. "Gentlemen," he said, his voice surprisingly steady, "it seems we have a fundamental misunderstanding. You believe you hold all the cards, but you're mistaken." He stepped back from the door, ushering them gesturally into his Spartan living room, a room dominated by a large, rugged desk piled high with tech gear. "Come in. Let's talk about the evidence you're so concerned about." The men exchanged quick, wary glances, but they followed. As they entered, the flicker of a LED caught their eyes. On a large monitor dominating the corner of the room, a series of high-resolution images began to cycle. The first was a crystal-clear close-up of Willow's eye, ancient and sad, revealing an intelligence far beyond that of a mere animal. It was followed by a sequence of infrared videos. Willow, moving gracefully through the dense undergrowth, her powerful frame captured in exquisite detail. Then came images of her carefully placing wildflowers on a small stone cairn, a poignant act of remembrance, revealing her profound grief. Another video showed her interacting with the offerings Ethan had left, her movements cautious, almost human-like in their deliberate grace. "This," Ethan stated, gesturing towards the monitor, his voice gaining strength, "is Willow. This is just a fraction of what I've documented. High-resolution photographs, videos with time-stamped metadata, audio recordings of her unique vocalizations. And it's all backed up. Multiple copies, off-site, with trusted contacts who have very strict instructions." He paused, letting his words sink in. "If anything were to happen to me, or if my livelihood were to be hampered, as you so eloquently put it, this entire collection of evidence would become public, simultaneously, on every major platform, mainstream and alternative. There would be no controlling the narrative then, would there?" He watched their carefully constructed facades waver, just for a flicker. The taller man's jaw tightened, the shorter man's eyes narrowed, a cold calculation replacing his earlier menace. Ethan pressed his advantage. "You see, I haven't just observed Willow. I've formed a connection. I've documented her sentience, her intelligence, her pain. I've spent weeks, months, building trust. And I knew, from the moment I found that first anonymous note, that people like you would eventually come sniffing around. So I prepared." He gestured towards a bookshelf, where a thick, leather-bound journal lay open. "My personal narrative, detailing every interaction, every observation. My thoughts on her species, her habitat, her right to exist without being hunted, captured, or exploited." Suddenly, a series of urgent, guttural vocalizations ripped through the calm afternoon air, echoing from the forest behind Ethan's cabin. It wasn't a cry of distress, but a deep, resonant warning filled with an ancient power. The sound was unmistakable. Willow. She was closer than she had ever dared come during the day, her presence a tangible force. The men in black stiffened, their heads snapping towards the windows, their carefully cultivated composure finally cracking. The vocalizations intensified, a rhythmic, powerful thrum that vibrated through the very floorboards, conveying a clear message of alarm and territorial defense. Ethan turned towards the sound, a knot of concern tightening in his gut, but also a surge of fierce pride. Willow was warning him, warning them. She understood the threat. "She knows you're here," Ethan said, his voice now tinged with a raw, undeniable emotion. "She trusts me. She sees you as a danger, not just to me, but to her kind. Your presence, your threats are alarming her. And when a creature like Willow is alarmed, the consequences can be unpredictable. For everyone. He looked back at their faces, now pale beneath their tans, eyes darting nervously towards the forest edge, where Willow's urgent calls continued to reverberate. The illusion of their absolute control had shattered. Ethan had played his hand, and Willow, in her powerful guttural warning, had just sealed the deal. The following morning, a crispness lingered in the air, but the chill that truly permeated Ethan's cabin was born of the previous day's encounter. He had played his hand, revealing the depth of his documentation, implying that the hard drive with Willow's images and videos was no longer under his sole control, a desperate bluff he hoped would resonate with their fear of exposure. The men in black had left, their final words a chilling promise of repercussions should his information ever surface. Their faces, usually so devoid of emotion, had shown a flicker of something akin to frustration, perhaps even a hint of respect for his unexpected defiance. He knew their departure was not a surrender, but a strategic retreat, a temporary cessation of hostilities. He felt a profound exhaustion, the kind that settles deep in the bones after a prolonged siege, but also a strange sense of liberation. He had stood his ground, not just for himself, but for Willow. He had gambled, and for now, it seemed to have paid off. Yet, the price of that victory weighed heavily on him. He had exposed her, however indirectly, to the very forces he sought to protect her from. Days turned into a week, then two. The black SUVs were gone from the remote roads. The strange feeling of being watched dissipated, replaced by the familiar quiet hum of the forest. Ethan continued his solitary life, but with a new vigilance. His camera was always within reach, his senses always attuned to the subtle shifts in the wilderness around him. He visited the river less frequently, a painful decision born of his new understanding. The less he interfered, the safer Willow would be. His role had shifted from active participant to silent guardian, a protector from the periphery. One evening, as twilight bled across the sky, painting the western horizon in hues of deep violet and fiery orange, Ethan sat on his porch, a steaming mug of tea warming his hands. He watched the first stars begin to prick the darkening canvas. A sound, faint at first, then growing in intensity, drifted from the direction of the river. It was a familiar vocalization, rich with a complex tapestry of low rumbles and soft chirps. Willow. She wasn't distressed, nor was she beckoning. It was a sound of presence, perhaps even of acknowledgement. He closed his eyes for a moment, absorbing the sound, letting it wash over him. In that moment, he understood. Willow was not a creature to be documented, to be revealed, to be studied under a microscope. She was a living, breathing testament to the wild, a secret that deserved its sanctity. The bond they had forged, born of shared grief and silent understanding, was something precious, too profound to be reduced to scientific papers or sensational headlines. He had learned more from her than any book could teach him about empathy, resilience, and the delicate balance of life in the ancient woods. His earlier impulse to expose the truth, to force humanity to confront its preconceived notions, had been born of a naive idealism. He now saw the potential for destruction that such a revelation could unleash. Willow's world, and by extension, the world of her kind, was far too fragile for the relentless, often brutal, intervention of humankind. The men in black, for all their menacing presence, had inadvertently reinforced this truth. Their very existence was proof of humanity's possessive nature, its need to control, to categorize, to exploit what it does not understand. Ethan rose from his chair, walking to the edge of the porch, his eyes scanning the tree line, not in search of her, but in quiet communion. He made a silent vow, a solemn promise to the ancient forest and its hidden inhabitants. His purpose was no longer to reveal, but to conceal. His every action would now be guided by a singular objective: to ensure Willow and her kind remained undisturbed, their secret safe within the embrace of the wilderness. He would be her silent sentinel, her unseen protector, a human barrier against the encroaching world. He thought of the anonymous note. Some things are best left undisturbed. He now fully understood its profound wisdom. The bond he shared with Willow was a testament to the extraordinary, an improbable connection between two disparate beings. He would cherish it, nurture it, but never exploit it. He would remain vigilant, always aware that the shadowy forces, though momentarily repelled, were never truly gone. Their chilling warning of consequences still echoed in his mind, a constant reminder of the stakes. The moon, now a slender crescent, began its slow ascent, casting long, dancing shadows across the forest floor. Ethan watched, a flicker of hope and determination in his eyes. The forest, dense and silent, held its breath, and in its heart, a secret, guarded by a man who had chosen reverence over revelation. The journey had stripped him bare, forced him to confront his own preconceptions, and ultimately reshaped his destiny. He was no longer just a reclusive photographer. He was a keeper of secrets, a silent witness to the wild's enduring magic. If this story touched your heart and made you wonder about the mysteries lurking in our world, please give this video a thumbs up, leave a comment below, sharing your thoughts, and don't forget to subscribe for more captivating tales. And for our next adventure, prepare yourself for a deep dive into ancient ruins and forgotten civilizations.